Hi, my name is Tori, and today I'm going to be talking about insanity and treatment of it in the long 18th century, focusing in England. And just a disclaimer before I get started, all my links for my sources are in the bio where I turned in my video. So the knowledge of mental illness in the early 18th century was slim to none. People were extremely uneducated, especially in England, to the point where mad doctors, who are at the time psychiatrists, would consider suicide and insanity to be interchangeable terms, in the sense that you must be crazy to kill anyone, let alone kill yourself. And this information was from my EBSCO source. The moral treatment kind of developed toward the second half of the 18th century. This was developed in Europe, and it was pretty much the only philosophy that was willing to actually cure the mentally insane rather than confine them elsewhere and still torture them. It emphasized how the environment can really impact whether someone is insane or not, or how they can be cured from insanity. Obviously, this is in less severe cases that the environment can cure or affect insanity, but it's still a pretty big factor. People also said at this time that insanity was caused by head trauma, and all the information was from my Toledo source. The mistreatment was terrible in the long 18th century, especially in the first half. Things started to get a little bit better in the second half, but there's still a long way to go. Rather than working to help the mentally ill, people really just made careers out of it instead, such as mad doctors or nurses or people that worked in insane asylums. They were horribly abused, and mad doctors would often say that if they were going to act like animals, then they should be treated like animals. People also theorized that the mentally ill could not feel pain or catch any diseases, so they were basically inhuman. And nothing but a responsibility to doctors. And I got that from my second EBSCO source. So there was a lot of growth in the long 18th century towards the second half when it came to the education of mental illness. The abuse definitely went down significantly. Of course, it was very prominent still, but it definitely decreased, which is something. People definitely became more educated on diagnosing people with mental illness rather than just categorizing them in one group, saying that they were just mentally ill. They learned that there were several different kinds of mental illnesses, which is very important in the terms of treatment and how they developed it or if they were born with it, and it just helped a lot with further on research. And also towards the second half of the 18th century, England moved toward the Great Confinement, or just confinement in general. This also led to a decrease in madhouses, which is very good because insanity was often greatly increased by madhouses because they were treated as if they were animals rather than humans who needed to get better. So confinement, as I mentioned, really occurred in the second half of the 18th century, and coincidentally, the number of mentally ill was increasing at this time. And this really just could have been because people are more aware of mental illness at the time. So they were just diagnosing more people because they were recognizing it more. The mentally ill were separated from their families and treated elsewhere rather than having to be managed in their own homes, which often led to a pretty abusive lifestyle. And this wasn't entirely prevalent in this area, but it began developing at this time. And I got that information from my first EBSCO source. So the knowledge of mental illness in the long 18th century of England was, as I mentioned in the beginning, slim to none, but there was a lot of growth in this period. Of course, there was a long way to go, but England definitely learned a lot between the first half and the second half of the long 18th century.